Cisco systems thought they owned the future of communication until their own arrogance triggered a $9 billion revenge story. I'm going to show you how one ignored engineer dismantled a corporate empire from the inside. I've seen many people give up after one failure, but Eric Yuan endured 8 visa rejections before finally reaching America to build the very company that would eventually humiliate his former bosses. To truly understand why I find this story so satisfying, we have to go back to 1,987 inches Taiwan, China. Eric Yuan was just a college freshman then, and he was miserable. Every time he wanted to see his girlfriend, he had to survive a grueling, bone-rattling 10-hour train ride across the country. As he sat on those crowded, suffocating trains, he began to daydream about a button he could press to see her face instantly. That desperate, lonely wish was the emotional seed for a technology that would change the world. Eric eventually made it to America, but it took 9 tries and a year and a half of sitting in those cold, hard plastic chairs at the embassy. By 2007, he was a brilliant engineer who had helped build WebEx from the ground up. That was when the giant, Cisco, moved in and bought the company for over $3 billion. They made Eric the vice president of engineering, but it was a gilded cage. I've seen men like Arthur Sterling before, men who care more about pinstripe suits and protecting their quarterly profits than actual innovation. Cisco was slow, bloated, and dangerously arrogant. They paid Eric a fortune to keep things exactly as they were, entirely disconnected from the people actually using the software. They thought they had bought his loyalty with a title and a paycheck, but they were actually planting the seeds of their own destruction. They didn't realize that Eric wasn't just another employee they could control, he was a visionary they were about to insult. By 2010, Eric was rich and secure, yet he told me he was completely miserable. He spent his days listening to WebEx customers who absolutely hated the product because it crashed constantly and didn't work on smartphones. Eric saw the future clearly. He knew video calling had to be mobile and cloud-based. For an entire year, he begged the executives at Cisco to let him rebuild the architecture from scratch, but they were smug. They looked at this brilliant man and told him no, because they didn't want to risk their current profits. They dismissed his vision entirely, choosing to protect an outdated cash cow instead of listening to the smartest person in the room. If you love seeing arrogant corporations get exactly what they deserve, you should subscribe and stay with me, because this is where things get interesting. Cisco thought they had Eric under control, but they vastly underestimated the willpower of a man who had already survived 8 rejections. They were about to learn that some people can't be bought. The rejection from the board felt like a personal insult to everything Eric had worked for. He described feeling like a prisoner in a very expensive cage, walking into that gleaming corporate headquarters every day while his soul was being crushed by a bureaucratic nightmare. While the executives like Arthur Sterling were patting themselves on the back for their short-term earnings, they were completely blind to the technological revolution happening right outside their tinted windows. They treated Eric like a maintenance worker for their aging software rather than the visionary who built it. I can only imagine the frustration building up inside him like a pressure cooker. He couldn't sleep, and he couldn't stop thinking about the millions of users who were desperate for a better solution, a solution he knew exactly how to build. Cisco's failure wasn't just a business mistake, it was a total lack of respect. They assumed that because they were paying him a massive salary, he would just stay quiet and watch his creation become obsolete. That arrogance was a fatal miscalculation that would eventually cost them billions of dollars in market share. In June of 2011, I watched Eric Yuan reach his absolute limit. He was 41 years old, a man with a family to support and a prestigious title that most people would kill for. He had a mountain of unvested Cisco stock options that felt more like golden handcuffs than a reward. Leaving meant throwing away a guaranteed fortune and stepping into a terrifying, silent unknown. But the pain of staying in that stagnant environment had finally eclipsed the fear of failing on his own. He realized that if he didn't build the future of video communication, someone else would, and he would spend the rest of his life regretting his own cowardice. So, Eric made the hardest decision of his life. He marched into the Human Resources office and formally resigned, walking away from the millions, the safety, and the hollow prestige. He decided he was no longer going to be a victim of Cisco's corporate rot. He was going to bet everything on his own vision. When word spread that the mastermind behind WebEx was leaving, the shockwaves echoed through the engineering department. Eric wasn't just walking out the door, he was lighting a match and tossing it over his shoulder. Eric wasn't just blindly leaping into the abyss, though. He had a meticulously crafted plan, a blueprint for a communication tool that would be so incredibly simple and flawless that it would make WebEx look like a relic of the Stone Age. He envisioned a platform where a massive group of people could connect instantly on any device with a single click, and he knew exactly who he needed to help him build it. In a stunning display of loyalty that would become legendary in Silicon Valley, Eric didn't leave that building alone. 40 of Cisco's absolute best engineers, roughly 5% of their entire research and development staff, packed up their desks and walked out the door right behind him. These weren't just random employees. They were the core architects, the brilliant minds that Arthur Sterling and his executive team had taken for granted. They believed in Eric so much that they abandoned their own secure jobs to follow him into the wilderness. Cisco's leadership watched in stunned silence as their top talent vanished in a single afternoon. Eric incorporated his new company in June of 2011. At the time, they didn't even have a cool name. Their working title was the painfully awkward SASB, but the name didn't matter half as much as the mission did. They managed to scrape together a $3 million seed round from early believers and immediately went into stealth mode. For nearly 2 years, Eric and his team of 40 defectors worked in absolute secrecy. They didn't do press releases or flashy launch parties, they just coded. They were rebuilding the entire concept of video conferencing from the ground up, prioritizing video quality and mobile compatibility over everything else. Meanwhile, back at Cisco, the executives were completely oblivious to the monster growing in their own backyard. They assumed Eric's little startup would inevitably fail, crushed by the immense market dominance of WebEx. They continued to milk their outdated software and ignore the growing chorus of complaints from their own user base. The sheer hubris of Cisco's leadership blinded them to the reality that their former star engineer wasn't just building a competitor, he was building their executioner. Slowly but surely, SASB began to transform. They finally rebranded to a much punchier name, Zoom. When they launched their first beta version, the results were nothing short of miraculous for anyone who used it. Users who had spent years fighting with WebEx plugins, battling audio echoes, and staring at frozen screens suddenly experienced something magical. Zoom just worked. You clicked a link, and you were instantly in a high-definition video room. There were no downloads, no complicated logins, and no crashing. Word of mouth began to spread like wildfire through the tech community, and early adopters were completely blown away by the flawless mobile experience. Eric's obsession with making the software frictionless was finally paying off. Businesses started quietly canceling their WebEx subscriptions and moving their teams over to Zoom. This raised a difficult question, though. Was it wrong for Eric to actively dismantle the very empire that had made him a millionaire? Some might call it a betrayal, but I see it as a moral necessity. When a company stops serving its people, someone has to build a better way. I'm curious, what would you have done in his position? Tell me in the comments. As Zoom began to gain traction, Eric knew this was the critical moment. He couldn't just build a better product, he had to build a fiercely loyal customer base that would never look back. He made a radical commitment to user happiness, famously replying to customer support emails himself, even late at night. He was relentless, adapting the software based on real-time feedback and moving at a speed that the bureaucratic nightmare of Cisco couldn't possibly match. This was a revelation for the industry. But here's the part that really caught Cisco off guard. Eric was proving that you didn't need to trap customers in massive, expensive contracts if your product was actually a joy to use. He wasn't just selling software, he was selling a solution to a problem that Cisco refused to admit existed. Every time a user had a positive experience, the gap between Eric's vision and Cisco's reality grew wider. He was playing a long game, and the executives in their pinstripe suits had no idea the rules had already changed. By the mid-2010s, all the pieces were moving into place. Zoom introduced a freemium model that was dangerously brilliant. Anyone could host a 40-minute meeting for free, which completely bypassed the corporate IT buyers that Cisco relied on. Instead of selling to executives, Zoom was being adopted organically by everyday employees. A marketing manager would use Zoom for a quick call, realize how much better it was than WebEx, and suddenly their whole department was using it. It was a Trojan horse strategy, sneaking into major corporations through the back door. Zoom was silently infecting Cisco's biggest clients, spreading user by user and department by department. The trap was meticulously set. Zoom wasn't just competing on features, they were completely changing the rules of distribution. They made the software so accessible and so reliable that returning to Cisco's clunky alternative felt like a punishment. If you want to see how this silent takeover eventually brought a giant to its knees, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the final reckoning. The stage was set for a confrontation that would change the tech world forever. I watched as the walls finally began to close in on Cisco. Their sales teams were returning from the field with stories that sounded like nightmares. Massive enterprise clients, companies that had been with Cisco for decades, were suddenly refusing to renew their WebEx contracts. When the executives desperately demanded to know why, the answer was always the same. Their own employees were demanding Zoom. I can only imagine the cold dread in that boardroom. The same men who had laughed Eric out of the room years ago were now staring at plummeting market share and a sea of furious shareholders. Their defensive moats and their aggressive sales tactics simply didn't matter anymore. The product was fundamentally broken, and now the entire world knew it. Cisco tried to pivot frantically, attempting to bolt new features onto WebEx to mimic the interface I saw in Zoom, but it was far too little and far too late. The underlying architecture was still the same outdated, crumbling mess that Eric had begged them to fix. They were forced to sit there and watch their billion-dollar asset bleed out, completely powerless to stop the inevitable. I am curious, do you think Cisco deserved to lose everything, or was Eric's move too ruthless? Let me know in the comments. The ultimate confrontation wasn't some loud shouting match in a glass boardroom. It was a slow, agonizing public humiliation played out through corporate earnings reports. Cisco tried to slash their prices, practically giving WebEx away just to keep their numbers up, but people still chose to pay for Zoom because it actually worked. And here is the part I find truly brilliant. Remember those 40 engineers who walked out with Eric? They were the exact people who knew every single flaw and every weak point in the WebEx code. I realized they hadn't just built a new product, they had engineered a precise, targeted weapon designed to exploit every vulnerability of their former employer. They knew exactly why WebEx crashed during large meetings, so they built Zoom to handle hundreds of participants without a single glitch. They knew why WebEx struggled with mobile video, so they made the Zoom app bulletproof on every device. It was a masterclass in asymmetrical warfare. Eric had taken Cisco's own brain trust and turned it into the very engine of their destruction. The reckoning finally arrived on a global stage. On April 18, 2019, I watched Eric Yuan stand on the balcony of the Nasdaq Stock Exchange to ring the opening bell. Zoom was going public, and the market responded with absolute euphoria. By the end of that first trading day, the company was valued at a staggering $9 billion. The world watched as the man who had been rejected for a visa 8 times, the man whose visionary pitch was arrogantly tossed in the trash by Cisco, became a newly minted billionaire. It felt like the purest form of poetic justice I had ever seen. Cisco, that lumbering giant that thought it could dictate the future through corporate bullying, was forced to watch its former employee achieve a level of success they could never dream of replicating. I think about those executives who denied him, left behind to explain to a furious board of directors how they had completely fumbled the greatest communication revolution of the decade. They had everything they needed to win, but their own pride became the weight that dragged them down. The fallout for Cisco was absolutely devastating. While Zoom's valuation continued to skyrocket, eventually reaching astronomical heights during the global shift to remote work, WebEx became the industry's biggest punchline. It became synonymous with corporate frustration, the software you were forced to use by your boss, rather than the software you actually wanted to use. I find it ironic that Cisco had paid over $3 billion for a platform that was now hemorrhaging relevance by the second. They had literally held the future of global communication in their hands, sitting right there in their own engineering department, and their own arrogance had caused them to crush it. The legacy of their leadership wasn't innovation, it was the catastrophic failure of losing Eric Yuan and his 40 most brilliant minds. They didn't just lose a simple product pitch, they lost the entire future of their industry to a man they thought was beneath them. For Eric, this victory was about so much more than the money. It was deeply personal. He had reclaimed his life and his dignity from a system that tried to stifle him. He was no longer just a frustrated employee, trapped in a miserable corporate hierarchy. He was the undisputed king of video communication, universally respected by his peers. I think back to the boy who endured those bone-rattling 10-hour train rides across China just to see the girl he loved. He had finally solved his own problem on a global scale. He had connected the world. More importantly, he had built a culture at Zoom that was the exact opposite of the toxicity he left behind at Cisco. He focused on delivering actual happiness to his users and his employees alike, proving that you do not have to be a tyrant to build an empire. Eric Yuan's story is the ultimate testament to the danger of corporate arrogance. Cisco thought they were invincible behind their billions of dollars and their ironclad contracts. They learned the hard way that you can never truly suppress a great idea, and you should never underestimate a visionary who has nothing left to lose. I've always believed that karma eventually comes to collect every debt. If you found this story of resilience and ultimate revenge as satisfying as I did, please hit that subscribe button right now. It helps me bring you more of these deep dives into the world's most incredible corporate battles. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.